Hello, BookTube. Yesterday I did a video called The 10 Most Influential People of Science Fiction, and it was based on an article by Robert Sabella that was published in 1984 in Thrust Science Fiction and Review magazine. Now, that video has garnered a little bit of discussion in the comments as well as a few emails. And obviously, everybody has their own view of the 10 most influential people, and I've been asked several times to do my own. I'm a little hesitant to do this because it's not an easy thing to do. I think Sabella has done really good groundwork there, and I would say I have no problem with his list for the most part. I have some quibbles, but for the most part, I think it's a very good list. And the reasoning, or not the reasoning, but the rules, I guess, of this is that it has to be someone that has made an impact on science fiction, that has changed science fiction because they were there or what they did. Now, it doesn't mean that it's, a favorite author or, somebody who sold well. But that becomes a little contentious because if somebody really sells well, then isn't that influential? But it's what people do with it after. And that's, there's a lot of judgment call and personal, as he says, personal prejudices that come in with it. On this list, I would not put Clifford Simak on there, even though I love him, as a writer. But I don't think he did anything that sort of, propelled science fiction in a different way. And looking at that way, propelling science fiction in a different way or changing it, I find it difficult to have 10 specific people that have done that. Unless I break down a couple of his, because I'm going to take a number of his and explain a little more, hopefully, about it. But it's difficult because the other ones are sort of a bridge in between. Well, let's get to this. And I'm chickening out and not doing it as a 1 to 10, the most important. I'm not doing that. I'm going to do it in historical order to sort of show a progression. Now, he starts out with Jules, he mentions Jules Verne's. I'm starting out with Jules Verne's because of his scientific romances, for the same reasons that Sabella did. It garnered an audience, and it was exciting, it was adventurous. I'm not going to repeat everything that was said because I'm only going to add some stuff along the way. Now, the next one is H.G. Wells, for the same reasons. 1895 was the time machine, and it was more sophisticated. It was critically acclaimed and still thought of for some of his writings as a foundational science fiction writer. Now, let's jump again to Hugo Gernsback. Now, Hugo Gernsback started Amazing Stories, and the first issue was April 1926. Now, that's not where he started with science fiction. Started more in the teens. He was an immigrant to the United States, and he was an inventor, but he also published a lot of electronics and radio magazines. He was getting early in on the radio game. But he also published fiction in it, some of his own. And he came up with the term science-fiction in the mid-teens. And when he started Amazing Stories, he gave science fiction or science-fiction a home. And he was guiding it to what he thought it should be. It should be stories that had a scientific value, a teaching value about gadgets. And as Sabella says, the writing ability took a little bit of a back seat to the scientific aspect of it. But the one thing that he really did was, as I say, made a home in a dedicated magazine for science fiction. Prior to that, as Sabella said, the stories were scattered throughout the pulps and other magazines. So now we have a home. We have a foresight. We have foresight, but we also have a vision of what science fiction / science fiction is going to be. And he encouraged fans to write in letters, to get together, to have groups, to have fan groups for this. And that made a big difference as well. People were now joining together, meeting, crossing, this is mostly in the United States at the time, but crossing borders of the states. And the first convention started possibly in late 20s, and many more were growing up in the 30s in the United States, and it was happening in the UK as well. And there were the conventions sort of sprung up, and in 1939 there was the first World Science Fiction Convention, chaired by Sam Moskowitz, who was a fan, started his own fan group. There's a lot of stories about him, but he became a writer, editor, and writer of fiction and nonfiction. So it spurred him on and many writers. So that was very important. But during that time, it was very pulpy, pulp fiction, as Sabella was saying, and I was saying in the previous video. It took John W. Campbell to take over the editorship of Astounding in October 1937. He took it over from F. Orland Tremaine, who was the editor at that time. Now, he had a new vision for science fiction, and that was to have it more socially conscious of writing about societies and human societies, and pulling it out of the pulp style of writing, giving it more gravitas, I guess you would say. Now, and he wasn't doing this all alone there either. Now, the one thing that Sabella missed was he had an assistant that actually did do a lot of the editing at the time and a lot of the work. Her name was Kay Tennant. She also sort of ran sort of gatekeeper for Campbell as well, and also soothed in some ways the egos of authors that came to see him. And one of those was Isaac Asimov, who was nurtured by Campbell. And he's next on the list, Isaac Asimov. And the reason for Asimov being on the list as changing science fiction is because several things that he did during this period. The 3 laws of robotics, and coining the term robotics in his 1941 short story Liar. And that has become commonplace and in the dictionary. And he coined other terms as well. And he was a massive, a prolific writer of not only science fiction, like fiction, but fact. And everybody knew his name. And his foundation stories were so popular and so influential. But because of his presence, he made a huge difference in science fiction because he had all these other concepts. Now, I know Sabella put in Heinlein there, but I'm taking Heinlein out of here in my top my top 10, and I'll explain more about that later at the end. So we've got Asimov. Now, the next sort of big move would be the new magazines that were coming out in 1949, the magazine of fantasy and science fiction started under the editorship of Anthony Boucher and J. Francis McComas. Now, it was a bit of a reaction against Astounding, but following its format in many ways. But John W. Campbell had this more narrow view of what science fiction should be and could do. And he rejected a lot of things that went outside of that. So some authors were not happy, new authors, some of them had different ideas that he wasn't buying into. So the magazine of fantasy and science fiction did, and it also opened it up with fantasy. So it allowed fantasy and science fiction to sort of merge a little bit and mingle in their pages. Shortly after that, H.L. Gold, Horace Gold, started Galaxy Science Fiction in October 1950. Now, again, he had a different vision, a slightly different vision, but the same way. He wanted to stress sort of the common people and had, as Sabella said, a satirical view of the future was throughout. And in the first 3 issues was a Clifford Simak story as well, so that didn't hurt. But if you look at the contents of the first 3 issues of Galaxy, you could see that there's something happening there. And it was an alternative to John W. Campbell. Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, stressed a few other things, as I talked about in the previous video. And it began a new age of science fiction, and it greatly changed it because the writers were more open. They were able to play with themes and ideas that were established during the pulp era and during John W. Campbell's time, and play with those ideas, expand them, twist them. They weren't able to do that so much in Astounding. There were other magazines, but none with editors as clever as these 3. And again, I'm lumping these 3 together as one person. So I hope you indulge me on that. Now, the next one follows on from this a little bit. Is the publication of a science fiction in books. It gave another new outlet roughly the same time as the magazine of fantasy and science fiction was happening, and the and Galaxy was happening. And 2 big publishers, as Sabella said, was Ace Books and Ballantine Books. Ace Books was edited by Donald Wollheim, a veteran fan during the 30s, editor. And so he edited these, and everybody knows the Ace doubles, that you flip them around and you've got another book on the other side. And they were cheap, and they reprinted a lot of stuff and eventually doing a lot of new stuff. Ian and Betty Ballantine took a slightly more upmarket view of science fiction, reprinting other stuff, but they were a little more discriminating on what they reprinted and printing new authors. But also, these publishers paid more than other magazines, than the magazines. So while Sabella says the magazines were falling, and there was a vacuum, and the paperbacks picked up the slack and filled the void, I think more it probably was that it caused it was one of the causes of the losing of magazines during the 50s was the paperback revolution there, in a sense, for science fiction, because they paid more. And why would somebody go to the magazines and get, a penny a word or 2 pennies? And occasionally, if it was really high stakes, they would get 3 pennies. 3 cents per word in the American ones. Now, again, following on from that is what was happening in the 50s, a big surge of science fiction that was happening. Now, it happened in films. Like you just look at the proliferation of science fiction films in American filmmaking during the 50s, the Cold War, and even in the UK here, and on TV with the Quatermass series, the three serials that were done. And there was, but the other big thing was radio science fiction. And in 1955 to 1958, NBC Radio started a radio science fiction, like more adult science fiction radio program called X-1. Now it mined the magazines for stories, and there was 126 episodes in total from 55 to 58. Asimov had 3 stories adapted. Bradbury, I think, was the biggest with 9 stories. Heinlein had 5. Simak had 6. And again, it was more adult. So this again was a change. It brought science fiction more into the open, along with radio and the burgeoning TV. Because what was happening around that time as well, there were science fiction TV shows that were starting. Twilight Zone was one of them, but it wasn't just specifically science fiction, but there were a few others that were specifically science fiction of lesser quality. But again, this was because of the radio, because of everything that came before it, radio, it became popular, so it became lucrative for the producers to push science fiction in other media, like TV. So then we got the Twilight Zone, and then, that without this, I don't think you'd have Gene Roddenberry doing Star Trek. That was another big leap for it too. But instead of putting Star Trek there as a big leap, around the same time, what was happening was Michael Moorcock. Michael Moorcock took over editorship of New Worlds in the UK here. Now, he took it over from John Carnell, who started it in the late, originally late 40s, but 50s onward. Now, again, like writers in the early 50s that were becoming a little disillusioned with John W. Campbell's view of science fiction, by the time the mid-60s came along, there were other writers experimenting in different things. Sex in science fiction, drug use, alternate thought states, all sorts of stuff like that, more sociological, that are sort of sometimes on the peripheral of science fiction. And they had a home in Michael Moorcock's New Worlds. He ushered in the new wave. Like, it was already happening, but he, again, like everything else, like Gernsback, had a home for science fiction. He had a home for new wave and promoted it, and it became bigger, and it allowed things like Dangerous Visions and More Dangerous Visions by Harlan Ellison and other writers to come out and explore and experiment with different ideas. Now, I don't really particularly like a lot of the new wave material, but I can't deny the fact that it was a bit of a revolution. So again, another stepping point or influence for science fiction. Now, I'm going to end up, if I've done my math correctly, with the 10th. And I'm going to say to, reluctantly, George Lucas and Star Wars. For all the same reasons that Sabella said, because it really, really opened up. It was an explosion on the popular conscience of having science fiction there in front of you. And it became like the producers, writers, not writers so much, but publishers, producers began to see this as, a money source, as a possibility. So they started doing more and more of it. So even though there was a lot of sludge that came out of this, and I think Star Wars is not that great science fiction, but it was hearkening back to the 20s for science fiction. So, 20s and early 30s pulp, space opera. There was good and bad with it, but once the dust settled, there were fans that did go on from that kind of material to other material, which they may never have if Star Wars wasn't there. And it allowed the public to feel okay with having science fiction being in their bestseller list. So as I say, if I'd done my homework right, that should be 10. Now, as I said, it's very difficult to do this because to me, like there are landmark ones, and then there's judgment calls on some other ones. Like I inserted Asimov rather than Heinlein because I think Heinlein is a little overstated, and there's I don't think he was as influential as people seem to think he was. And I disagree with Sabella to say that he was the first to do these things of, talking about the common man and having, a realistic future setting. There were other writers that were doing that, and I think even better at the time and before him. So he wasn't a pioneer in that, but he might have refined it, yes, and it was influential. But as I say, it's a judgment call which one of those for that. But the core ones are to me going to be Verne, Wells, Gernsback, John W. Campbell, the McComas and Butcher, Gold, and the Wollheim and Ballantyne and Moorcock. Those are the main ones, and even reluctantly, as I say, George Lucas. So the others are sort of put in, but like going back to the publishing. Now they weren't doing Wollheim and the Ballantynes weren't doing this in a vacuum. There were people that came before. Even Wollheim published one of the very earliest collections of science fiction in book form. The other one, there was two others. Adventures into, this is the British edition, Adventures in Time and Space. This is a cut down version, and it's edited by Raymond J. Healy and J. Francis McComas, the same J. Francis McComas who was a co-editor of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. The other big editor at the time and continued on to do a huge amount of material is Groff Conklin. I don't have his first one, but this one here was published in, this is second printing from 1948, but it was originally came out in 1948. It's a treasury of science fiction. You see, this was the foundation that the book publishing was built on, and then it went a lot more, not just a little, a lot more mainstream during the 50s. And as I say, like there's other people, like Burroughs was put on the list, and I agree that he is important, but did he actually change science fiction? I think there were other people that you could easily put in with him, but just a tier below, at the time, A. Merritt, Ray Cummings. These were super popular at the same time. So you could pretty well make an argument for each of them. Burroughs, though, did have a bit of an edge on them. But did he actually change science fiction? See, that's the question. But then again, did Asimov change science fiction? Well, that's a judgment call. Did X-1 and the radio? See, that's the one thing I cheated there. I didn't. It's not a person, but I hope that's okay. X-1 and radio science fiction. Did it actually change science fiction? I think it did to a certain extent, and it was happening here in the UK as well with Journey into Space. On the radio around the same time in the 50s. Now, then we go to the 30s. We got all these people like, H.P. Lovecraft, which is really important. And he could theoretically be put on a list like this, but he only did a little, he wasn't all science fiction. He's important for a different genre that sort of branched off. The same as Robert E. Howard. Those are important people, but in the aspect of mainstream science fiction, they don't quite fit into this like the rules of this, and also like Sam Moskowitz to me would be one of them, because he was instrumental, as I say, in a lot of stuff that was happening in New York in the 30s and so was Donald Wollheim, Isaac Asimov so peripherally, but Frederick Pohl and that, like the fans in the 50s who developed into other things. So anyway, I hope I did do my math correctly, and I mentioned everybody here. I think I got all 10. I'm looking through my notes here, and as I say, I doubled up or tripled up on a couple of them. But yeah, so that's my 10 most influential people. As I say, I cheated a little bit with X minus one. But I would love to hear other people's. If you have a BookTube channel, I'd love to hear what you do. But as I say, either follow the rules of that it was influential and changed science fiction, and make an argument for that, or bend the rules a little bit, but explain how you're bending the rules. Anyway, this is going on longer than I expected, but thank you, BookTube.